The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves across Fort Liberty's parade ground as families gathered for the Medal of Honor ceremony. Margaret Chen, 52, stood awkwardly near the back of the crowd, her worn Walmart dress coat a stark contrast to the polished military uniforms and designer outfits surrounding her. The ceremony wouldn't begin for another hour, but already the social hierarchies were establishing themselves. Officer wives clustered in tight circles, their jewelry catching the morning sunlight as they discussed vacation homes in the Outer Banks and their children's acceptances to prestigious universities. "Excuse me, ma'am," sneered Lieutenant Colonel. Harrison's wife, Patricia, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed and her navy dress clearly from Nordstrom. "I think you might be in the wrong place. The public viewing area is over there." She gestured dismissively toward a roped-off section far from the main ceremony. Margaret's weathered hands tightened around her purse strap. The purse was a Christmas gift from Danny 3 years ago, bought with his first Army paycheck. It had been expensive then, almost $50, but now the faux leather was cracking at the edges. I received an invitation. My son." "Your son?" Patricia's laugh was sharp as glass, drawing the attention of nearby families. "Honey, look around. These are military families. Real military families." Her eyes scanned Margaret's frayed coat, her discount store shoes, the simple gold band on her finger that had cost $30 at a pawn shop. "What's your son's rank?" Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. The other officer wives were staring, now their expressions ranging from amused condescension to outright hostility. "Private first class," she whispered. The circle of officer wives erupted in barely contained giggles. Mrs. Brennan, the post commander's wife, stepped forward with a patronizing smile. "A PFC's mother at a Medal of Honor ceremony? That's precious. Did you get lost looking for the family readiness group bake sale? Maybe she's here to clean the restrooms," whispered Mrs. Davidson, wife of a full colonel, loud enough for everyone to hear. Margaret's face burned red, but she stood her ground. She thought of the letter in her purse, the official military envelope that had arrived 2 weeks ago. The invitation came directly from Colonel Martinez. It specifically mentioned— "Colonel Martinez probably sent it by mistake," Patricia interrupted, her voice gaining confidence as more wives gathered to watch the spectacle. "These ceremonies are for heroes, dear, not for—" She paused, looking Margaret up and down with theatrical disdain. "Whatever your boy did to scrape by." From across the parade ground, Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenching. He'd served 3 tours with Margaret's son and knew exactly why she was here. But orders were orders. The full story remained classified until after the ceremony. He started walking toward the commotion, his anger building. With each step, Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She thought of Danny, her boy who'd enlisted straight out of high school when the bills became too much. The boy who sent half his pay home to help with her medical treatments, even though it meant he ate ramen noodles for dinner most nights. The boy whose last letter had arrived 3 months ago with a single line that haunted her dreams. "Mom, I did something that matters, finally." "I think we should call security," Mrs. Brennan announced loudly. "This woman is clearly disturbed." She probably read about the ceremony in the newspaper and thought she could sneak in. The crowd of onlookers was growing, and Margaret felt their stares like physical weight. She wanted to run, to disappear back to her studio apartment and forget this humiliation ever happened. But Danny had asked her to come. His letter had been so specific. "Mom, be there on October 15th. It's important. More important than anything that's ever happened to our family." As the crowd settled into formation, Margaret retreated to a bench near the maintenance shed, trying to become invisible. Her phone buzzed, another medical bill she couldn't afford. Stage 3 breast cancer didn't wait for convenience, and the treatments had drained their savings long before Danny deployed. She stared at the bill. $847 for last week's chemotherapy session. Even with the basic military family insurance, her co-pays were crushing. She'd have to choose between the electric bill and her medication again this month. "Mrs. Chen?" A young soldier approached cautiously. Corporal Mike Stevens, barely 19, had the same nervous energy Danny used to have. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but Margaret could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the look of someone still figuring out how to be a soldier. Margaret looked up, surprised anyone here knew her son's name. "Yes, I am." Mike's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Holy shit." "Sorry, ma'am. Holy cow. You're actually here." He sat down beside her without invitation, his enthusiasm bubbling over. "Your son saved my life." "What do you mean?" Mike pulled out his phone, showing her a photo of a group of soldiers in Afghanistan. Danny was in the center, grinning at the camera, his arm around Mike's shoulders. "Afghanistan. Our convoy got hit by an IED outside Kandahar. I was trapped in the burning vehicle, unconscious from the blast. And Danny," Mike's voice cracked, "Mom, what your son did that day, it wasn't human. It was something else entirely." Before Margaret could respond, Patricia Harrison appeared, with 2 military police officers and a small crowd of followers. Her face was flushed with righteous indignation. "Officers, this woman is disrupting the ceremony. She's clearly mentally unstable, claiming her son is receiving the Medal of Honor when we all know that's impossible. She's probably one of those homeless veterans who hang around the base looking for handouts." Margaret wasn't a veteran. She'd never served a day in her life. But Patricia's accusations stung anyway, because Margaret knew how close she'd come to homelessness during the worst of her medical treatments. "Ma'am, we need to see your identification and invitation," the senior MP said professionally. Sergeant First Class Johnson had been working security for these ceremonies for 8 years, and he'd seen every type of gatecrasher and confused family member. Margaret fumbled with her purse, producing a crumpled envelope addressed in official military letterhead. Her hands shook as she handed it over, certain they would find some mistake, some reason to arrest her for trespassing. Johnson examined it carefully, his expression shifting from routine authority to confusion, then to something approaching reverence. He looked at the letterhead, checked the official seal, and read the contents twice. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, his entire demeanor changing, "you need to come with us, right now." "Am I under arrest?" Margaret's voice trembled. "No, ma'am, you're late for the VIP reception." "And ma'am," he turned to Patricia Harrison with ice in his voice, "you need to apologize to this lady immediately." Patricia's face went white. "I don't understand. This is Mrs. Margaret Chen, mother of Private First Class Daniel Chen, Medal of Honor recipient, the guest of honor at today's ceremony." Johnson's voice carried across the gathered crowd. "And you just publicly humiliated the mother of the bravest soldier I've ever heard of." The walk to the VIP tent felt like a death march for Patricia Harrison and her followers. Word was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The woman they'd mocked and dismissed was the reason they were all here today. Margaret walked beside Sergeant Johnson, her mind reeling. Medal of Honor? Her Danny? The quiet boy who used to spend hours building model airplanes and reading military history. Books was receiving the nation's highest military decoration. "Sergeant Johnson," she said quietly, "there must be some mistake. Danny's just a radio operator. He fixes communications equipment." Johnson smiled grimly. "Ma'am, your son did a lot more than fix radios. But that's not my story to tell." The VIP tent buzzed with conversation between high-ranking officers and their families. Margaret felt completely out of place among the stars and eagles adorning every collar. Generals and colonels mingled with congressmen and defense contractors, their conversations mixing military jargon with political shop talk. Colonel Martinez, a stern-faced man with graying temples and 3 combat deployments under his belt, spotted her immediately. His face broke into a genuine smile, the first one Margaret had seen all day. "Mrs. Chen!" His voice carried across the tent, causing every conversation to halt. Distinguished guests turned to look at the small, plainly dressed woman who had commanded the colonel's attention. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Patricia Harrison, who had followed at a distance to watch Margaret's final humiliation, stepped forward with wavering confidence. Colonel, I tried to explain to this woman that she's in the wrong place. Clearly there's been some administrative error. Mrs. Harrison, Colonel Martinez's voice could have frozen lava. His combat experience had taught him to identify threats. Quickly, and right now, Patricia represented a threat to the dignity of this ceremony. You will apologize to Mrs. Chen immediately, then remove yourself from this tent. Excuse me, Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. You heard me correctly. This woman is the guest of honor's mother. Her son is receiving the Medal of Honor. Today for actions that saved 37 lives, including the life of every man in his platoon. The colonel's eyes blazed with barely controlled fury. He single-handedly turned a catastrophic ambush into a rescue mission that military historians will study for decades. Now apologize. The tent fell silent, except for the flutter of flags in the breeze. A congressman's wife gasped audibly. The base commander's aide started frantically typing notes on his phone. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Her world was crumbling in real time. I didn't know. Your ignorance is not an excuse for your behavior. Mrs. Chen raised a hero while fighting cancer and working 2 jobs. Your son works at his father's law firm. Apologize now. I'm sorry, Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible. Louder, so everyone can hear you. So everyone understands the difference between real sacrifice and petty social posturing. I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. As Patricia slunk away, her social circle already beginning to distance themselves from her, Colonel Martinez turned to Margaret with gentle eyes. Mrs. Chen, your son asked me personally to make sure you were treated with the highest respect today. He said you taught him everything he needed to know about sacrifice and putting others first. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Medal of Honor? But Danny is just, Private First Class Daniel Chen is a hero, ma'am. And after today, the whole world will know it. As Colonel Martinez led Margaret through the VIP reception, she began to understand the significance of the day. This wasn't just another military ceremony. This was an event that would be remembered in military history. The Secretary of Defense was here. So was the Army Chief of Staff. Camera crews from every major news network had set up positions around the parade ground. Colonel, Margaret said hesitantly, can you tell me what happened? Nobody will give me details about Danny's deployment. Martinez paused beside a display of military memorabilia. Mrs. Chen, what I'm about to tell you is the reason your son will never have to buy another drink in any military bar for the rest of his life. He gestured to chairs away from the crowd. 3 months ago, your son's platoon was conducting a routine patrol in the Spin Bolduc region of Afghanistan. Intelligence indicated the area was clear of enemy activity. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Margaret gripped her purse tighter. What happened? They rolled into the largest Taliban ambush in that sector for 2 years. The enemy had been planning this attack for weeks, positioning fighters in a complex kill zone designed to destroy an entire American unit. The colonel's voice took on the cadence of an after-action report. The initial IED blast flipped their lead vehicle and wounded their squad leader. 37 American soldiers found themselves trapped in open ground, with Taliban fighters shooting from concealed positions in 3 directions. Margaret felt her heart racing. And Danny? Your son was the platoon's radio operator. 19 years old, lowest-ranking soldier in the unit. But when Sergeant Morrison went down, Danny did something that still gives me chills. Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, your son took command of that platoon like he'd been leading men for 20 years. Under continuous enemy fire, he coordinated a fighting withdrawal that should be taught at every military academy in the country. Across the tent, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached with 2 other soldiers. Ma'am, I'm Rodriguez. I served with Danny. Colonel, are you telling her about Kandahar? I'm trying to give her the basics before the ceremony. Rodriguez shook his head. Sir, with respect, there are no basics to what happened that day. What Danny did defied every law of physics and probability. Margaret looked between the 2 men. Please, I need to understand. What did my son do? Rodriguez sat down across from her. Mom, your boy turned a military disaster into the most successful combat rescue in Afghanistan theater history, but that's just the beginning of the story. 3 months earlier, Spin Boldak, Afghanistan. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains gold when PFC Daniel Chen's platoon rolled out for what should have been a routine patrol. Danny adjusted his radio headset, running through communications checks with base, while studying the terrain map spread across his lap. He'd been in country for 8 months, long enough to develop the nervous alertness that kept soldiers alive, but not long enough to become complacent. Something felt wrong about today's mission. The intelligence briefing had been too confident, too certain about enemy movements in an area where certainty was usually a luxury they couldn't afford. Looking good out there, Chen, Sergeant Morrison called from the turret. Nice and quiet, just how we like it. Danny keyed his radio. Base plate. This is Reaper 6. Still no contact, but... He paused, studying the ridgeline ahead. Something doesn't feel right about this valley. Reaper 6, maintain course. Intelligence shows no enemy activity in your sector. The words were barely out of Morrison's mouth when the world exploded. The IED buried in the road lifted their lead Humvee 3 feet into the air before slamming it down on its side. The blast wave shattered every window in the convoy, tore the doors off the second vehicle, and left Danny's ears ringing like cathedral bells. But the explosion was just the beginning. AK-47 fire erupted from concealed positions in the surrounding buildings. PKM machine guns opened up from the ridgeline. RPGs streaked across the valley like deadly fireworks, exploding against vehicle armor and nearby rocks. Contact! Contact! IED strike! Lead vehicle down! Danny shouted into his radio as chaos erupted. Around him, multiple casualties. We are taking effective fire from 3 directions. Sergeant Morrison slumped unconscious in the turret, blood streaming from a head wound where shrapnel had penetrated his helmet. Specialist Jackson was screaming. In the back seat, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. Around them, the Taliban fighters who had waited patiently in ambush positions now poured automatic weapons fire into the trapped convoy. The lead vehicle was on fire. The soldiers inside were either dead or trapped. The remaining vehicles had no cover except 2 partially destroyed buildings that offered minimal protection from the crossfire. Chen, get us out of here. Corporal Williams yelled from the driver's seat, his voice cracking with panic. But Danny was already moving, his mind processing the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. Despite having no formal leadership training beyond basic combat skills, something clicked in his mind. He could see the entire battlefield like a chessboard, every Taliban position, every avenue of escape, every danger to his men. Negative. We don't leave Morrison and the lead vehicle crew. Williams, you and Martinez set up a base of fire behind that wall. Jackson, can you move? I think my leg's broken. Then you're our radio backup. Everyone else, we're going to that building. Danny pointed to a partially destroyed structure that offered the only real cover. We move on my mark, and we move together. Nobody gets left behind. What happened next would be analyzed by military tacticians for years to come. A 19-year-old private first class, with no leadership experience beyond video games and war movies, took command of a platoon under fire and began orchestrating one of the most successful small unit actions in modern military history. Rodriguez, you and Stevens laid down suppressing fire on that ridgeline. Don't let them get comfortable up there. Danny's voice cut through the chaos with unnatural calm. Martinez, you see that muzzle flash from the second building? That's a PKM. Put your saw on it and don't let up. Private First Class Danny Chen, who 3 months earlier had been stocking shelves at a grocery store in Sacramento, began coordinating a complex military operation while bullets whined over his head. Baseplate, this is Reaper 6. We are in. Contact with estimated 15 to 20 enemy fighters. I need immediate close air support and medevac for multiple casualties. Reaper 6, be advised, closest air support is 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position? Danny looked around at his trapped, outnumbered, outgunned platoon. The smart tactical decision was to withdraw immediately, abandon the lead vehicle crew, and call in artillery on the entire valley. It's what the textbooks would recommend. It's what would save the most American lives. Negative, baseplate. We have wounded soldiers in the lead vehicle. We're not leaving without them. The next 30 minutes became a masterclass in small unit tactics executed by a teenager who'd never led anything more complex than a raid in Call of Duty. But somehow, impossibly, it worked. Danny positioned his men to create interlocking fields of fire that suppressed the Taliban positions. He called in danger-close mortar strikes that walked artillery rounds within 50 meters of his own position. He coordinated fire and movement techniques that kept the enemy off balance while his soldiers advanced by bounds toward the trapped lead vehicle. Stevens, you see that guy with the RPG? He's about to take out our only cover. Take him down. I don't have a clear shot. Then make one. Rodriguez, lay down covering fire on that window. Stevens, you have 3 seconds. The Taliban fighter with the RPG dropped as Stevens' bullet found its mark. The enemy attack faltered for a crucial moment, and Danny seized the opportunity. Everyone up. We're moving to the lead vehicle now. Under continuous enemy fire, Danny led his platoon in a coordinated assault that reached the burning Humvee and began extracting casualties. Sergeant Morrison was unconscious but alive. Private Collins had a sucking chest wound but was stable. The driver, Specialist Wong, was trapped under the dashboard with both legs broken. They had successfully reached their trapped comrades, but the building they'd been using for cover was beginning to collapse from repeated RPG strikes. And that's when the situation went from dangerous to impossible. The Taliban rocket that struck their makeshift stronghold wasn't aimed at any particular target. It was just one of dozens of RPGs the enemy fighters were pouring into the valley. But this one hit the precise structural weak point that brought down a section of roof, trapping 6 soldiers under concrete slabs and twisted rebar. The explosion was deafening. When the dust cleared, Danny could hear voices from under the rubble, wounded, terrified, but alive. Rodriguez was trapped. So was Sergeant Brooks, who had a newborn daughter back in Georgia. Private Martinez, whose mother made the best tamales Danny had ever tasted, was somewhere under that concrete. The Taliban, sensing weakness, increased their rate of fire. Machine gun bullets chewed chunks out of the remaining walls. Mortar rounds began falling closer to the American position. "We need to pull back," Corporal Williams shouted over the gunfire. "We can't help them." Danny looked at the collapsed building, then at his men. Half his platoon was trapped under rubble. The other half was scattered behind inadequate cover, running low on ammunition, with wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. Every piece of military training said the same thing. Tactical withdrawal was the only option. Save who you can, call in artillery, write the after-action report, mourn the dead and move on. But Danny Chen had never been particularly good at following rules. "No," Danny said quietly. Then louder, "No, we don't leave anyone behind." He stripped off his body armor and helmet. The extra weight would slow him down. "Maintain suppressing fire on that ridgeline. When I go for the building, give me everything you've got." "Chen, that's suicide. That's an order." Danny's voice carried authority. "No 19-year-old should possess. And when I bring them out, you better be ready to cover us." Williams stared at him in disbelief. "You're not in command here." "I am now. Morrison's unconscious, Brooks is trapped, and I'm the one with the radio. So either follow my orders or get the hell out of my way." The first rescue run nearly killed him. Taliban bullets chewed up the ground around his feet as he sprinted across 50 meters of open ground. A sniper's bullet creased his shoulder, spinning him around, but not dropping him. He dove through the building's shattered entrance as concrete chips exploded from rifle fire. The building was a maze of fallen concrete and twisted metal, but Danny could hear voices underneath, wounded, scared, but alive. He followed the sounds deeper into the collapsed structure, crawling through spaces barely wide enough for his body. He found Rodriguez first, pinned under a beam but conscious. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were alert. "Chen, what the hell are you doing here?" "Taking you home, hermano." It took 12 minutes to dig Rodriguez free and drag him to safety. 12 minutes of continuous gunfire from his platoon to keep the Taliban suppressed. 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours, but there were 5 more men still trapped. The second rescue run broke every rule of military common sense. The Taliban had adjusted their fire, anticipating Danny's route. Concrete chips exploded around him as he dove through the building's shattered entrance, following the sounds of voices deeper into the collapsed structure. Private Martinez was trapped under a concrete slab, his chest compressed but breathing. Sergeant Brooks lay unconscious nearby, blood seeping from multiple cuts, but his pulse steady. "Chen!" Martinez gasped. "You came back!" "Always, brother." Danny positioned himself under the concrete slab. At 140 pounds soaking wet, he had no business trying to lift debris that would challenge a construction crew, but adrenaline and desperation make their own rules. The slab moved. Inch by impossible inch, Danny levered it up while Martinez crawled. Free! His back screamed in protest, muscles tearing under the impossible load, but he held it until Martinez was clear. Then came the deadly sprint back to safety. Danny half-carrying Martinez while bullets whined overhead. His platoon's covering fire was perfect. Every Taliban muzzle flash met with immediate suppression. 3 men rescued, 3 still trapped. His platoon was running low on ammunition. The Taliban were getting bolder, moving closer. Radio chatter indicated enemy reinforcements were en route. Any rational soldier would have called for evacuation and written off the remaining casualties as acceptable losses. Danny Chen had never been particularly rational. The third run almost killed him. Twice, a sniper's bullet creased his scalp, leaving a bloody furrow that filled his eyes with blood. An RPG exploded close enough to lift him off his feet and slam him into a wall, cracking 2 ribs and filling his lungs with concrete dust. But he found Brooks and dragged him to safety. The unconscious sergeant's dead weight nearly impossible to manage while crawling through the rubble. 2 more runs. 2 more impossible sprints through hell. Each time, his men laid down covering fire that kept the Taliban at bay just long enough. Each time, Danny disappeared into that death trap of a building and emerged with another soldier who would go. Home to his family, Specialist Thompson was conscious but trapped under twisted rebar that had punctured his leg. Danny spent 20 minutes digging him free, working with his bare hands while enemy fire chewed up the building around them. Private Kowalski was the hardest to reach, buried deepest in the rubble with a broken arm and possible internal injuries. Danny had to move 3 separate concrete slabs to reach him, each one heavier than the last, his strength failing with every lift. When he carried out the last man, Kowalski, unconscious but breathing, Danny collapsed face first into the dirt. His hands were raw hamburger from moving concrete. His uniform was shredded. Blood ran from a dozen cuts and scrapes. His back felt like someone had driven railroad spikes into his spine, but all 37 members of his platoon were alive. The air support arrived 15 minutes later to find the Taliban fighters retreating and Danny Chen unconscious from exhaustion, surrounded by the wounded soldiers he'd refused to abandon. Present day. Fort Liberty back at the ceremony, Margaret sat transfixed as Colonel Martinez finished describing Danny's actions. The VIP tent had grown quiet, even the most senior officers hanging on every word. "Mrs. Chen," the colonel continued, "what your son did that day violated every principle of tactical common sense. He should have died 5 times over, but he brought out every single man." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Mom, I was the first one Danny pulled out of that building. I watched him go back in 4 more times, each run more dangerous than the last. The Taliban were shooting at him from 3 directions and he just kept going." "But why?" Margaret whispered. "Why would he risk his life like that?" Rodriguez smiled sadly. "Because that's who you raised him to be. Danny talked about you all the time, ma'am. How you worked 2 jobs while fighting cancer. How you never gave up on him, never left him behind, no matter how hard things got. Colonel Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, your son told me something before we shipped him back to the States for this ceremony. He said, I learned everything. I know about courage from my mom. She fought cancer and poverty and never once complained. If she could do that, I could bring my guys home. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Around the tent, hardened combat veterans were wiping their eyes. The congressman's wife, who had watched Patricia's earlier cruelty, stepped forward. Mrs. Chen, I'm Sarah Richardson. My husband chairs the House Armed Services Committee. I want you to know that we're introducing legislation to improve medical benefits for military families. Your son's story, what you've been through, it's exactly why we need to do better. The base commander, General Peterson, approached with genuine respect. Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 32 years. I've seen a lot of brave soldiers, but what your son did, that's going to be taught at West Point. They're going to study his tactics for decades. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, generals and colonels and politicians, all showing her the respect she'd never received in her life. I still can't believe it. Danny never mentioned any of this in his letters. That's because he doesn't think he did anything special. Rodriguez laughed. He keeps saying he was just doing his job. Last week, a reporter asked him about being a hero, and Danny said, heroes are people like my mom who fight impossible battles every day and never quit. I just had one bad day at work. Colonel Martinez checked his watch. Mrs. Chen, we need to get you seated for the ceremony. But there's one more thing you should know. The Army has offered Danny a direct commission to second lieutenant. He turned it down. Why? Because he wants to earn it. He's enrolled in officer candidate school, and he wants to work his way up through the ranks. He said his mother taught him that nothing worthwhile comes easy. As they prepared to leave the VIP tent, Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Patricia Harrison, her face streaked with tears. Mrs. Chen, I know I already apologized, but I need to say something else. I have 2 sons. They've never faced anything more dangerous than a lacrosse game. Your son saved 37 lives while I was worried about whether my landscaper was overcharging me for rose bushes. Patricia's voice was shaking. I don't know how to make up for what I said, but if there's anything at all, that you need, please let me help. You've sacrificed more for this country than all of us combined. Margaret studied Patricia's face, seeing genuine remorse and something approaching humility. Thank you. That means more than you know. The parade ground transformed as hundreds of soldiers formed precise ranks. Margaret found herself seated in the front row, directly facing the podium where the Secretary of Defense would present the nation's highest military honor. The ceremony began with the posting of colors, the American flag and Army colors carried by an honor guard whose precision movement spoke to countless hours of practice. The Army band played the Star-Spangled Banner, and Margaret felt a pride so intense it was almost painful. As the Secretary of Defense stepped to the podium, Margaret spotted Danny among the honor guard formation. Even at a distance she could see he'd changed. The boy who'd left for Afghanistan had returned as a man, his shoulders broader, his bearing more confident, his eyes holding depth she'd never seen before. But when he spotted her in the front row, his face broke into the same smile that had melted her heart since he was 3 years old. The citation reading seemed to last forever, but Margaret hung on every word. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as radio-telephone operator with Company A, 2nd Battalion, 35th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 25th Infantry Division, in action against enemy forces on 15th July 2024 in the vicinity of Spin Boldak, Afghanistan. The citation continued, describing in formal military language the impossible heroism that Margaret now understood. Each word carried the weight of 37 lives saved. of a son who had chosen courage over safety, sacrifice over self-preservation. Private First Class Chen's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. When the secretary placed the medal around Danny's neck, the entire crowd erupted in applause. But Margaret only had eyes for her son, who mouthed, "I love you, Mom," across the parade ground. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. Generals and privates, congressmen and military spouses, all on their feet, celebrating the quiet hero who had refused to leave anyone behind. After the ceremony, as families mingled and photographers captured the moment, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who wanted to meet the Mother of Medal of Honor recipient Daniel Chen. A young military wife approached nervously. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Jennifer Martinez. My husband served with Danny. I just wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For raising the kind of man who brought my husband home. Tommy was one of the soldiers trapped in that building. Because of Danny, my daughter still has a father." More families approached, each with their own story of how Danny's actions had affected their lives. The mother of Rodriguez, who flew in from Texas. The father of Specialist Thompson, a gruff construction worker who cried openly as he hugged Margaret. "Your boy saved my son's life," he said simply. "If you ever need anything at all, you call me." Patricia Harrison approached with her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. His face was grave as he extended his hand to Margaret. "Mrs. Chen, I need to apologize for my wife's behavior and my own failure to intervene. What happened this morning was inexcusable." Margaret shook his hand. "We all make mistakes, Colonel. The important thing is learning from them. Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 22 years. I've seen a lot of heroes, but what your son did, that's something else entirely. He's a credit to everything we stand for." Patricia stepped forward, her earlier arrogance completely gone. "Mrs. Chen, I've been thinking about what happened today, about how quickly I judged you, how wrong I was about everything. I want to do something to make amends." "That's not necessary." "Please, let me finish. I chair the Officers' Wives Club. We raise money for military families facing hardship. I want to establish a fund in Danny's honor, specifically for families dealing with medical expenses while serving their country." Margaret felt tears welling up again. "That's very generous." "It's not generous. It's the least we can do. You've been fighting your own war while your son was fighting overseas, and you've done it with more grace than I could ever manage." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to understand that this day was about more than just Danny's medal. It was about recognition, not just for her son's heroism, but for the sacrifices made by military families across the country. Congressman Richardson approached with his wife. "Mrs. Chen, I meant what my wife said earlier about the legislation. But I also want to discuss something else. The Army is recommending Danny for a full scholarship to any university he chooses after his service. We want to make sure that happens." "He's always been smart," Margaret said proudly. "Before he enlisted, he wanted to study engineering. Then he'll study engineering, at MIT if he wants. The nation owes him that much." Later that evening, Margaret and Danny sat on the porch of their small apartment, watching the North Carolina sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Medal of Honor lay on the table between them, catching the last rays of sunlight. The afternoon had been a whirlwind of interviews and photographs. Danny had handled it all with the same quiet grace he'd shown since returning from Afghanistan, deflecting praise and insisting that he'd only done what any soldier would do. "Mom," Danny said quietly, "I need you to know something. Everything I did over there I learned from you." Margaret looked at her son in surprise. "What do you mean? When Dad left, you could have given up. The bills, the medical treatments, working 2 jobs while fighting cancer. Anyone would have understood if you'd just stopped trying. But you never left me behind, no matter how hard things got." Danny's voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the emotion underneath. When those guys were trapped under that building, all I could think about was what you taught me. Family doesn't quit on family. And those men, they were my family. Margaret reached over and took her son's hand, noticing the scars on his knuckles from digging through concrete and rebar. I'm so proud of you, Danny. But I'm not proud because you won a medal. I'm proud because you became the man I always knew you could be. You know what the hardest part was? Danny continued, staring out at the darkening sky. Not the Taliban shooting at me, not lifting those concrete slabs. It was knowing that if I didn't make it out, you'd be alone again. Like when Dad left. Margaret's heart clenched. She'd never told Danny how close she'd come to giving up during the worst of her treatments, how the only thing that kept her fighting was knowing he needed her to be strong. Danny, you were never a burden. You were the reason I kept going. I know that now. But when I was over there, lying in my bunk at night, I'd think about you working double shifts at the diner while getting chemo. I'd think about how you'd pack my lunch for school, even when you could barely stand up. That's real courage, Mom. What I did was just instinct. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, Danny would report to Officer Candidate School at Fort Moore, Georgia. Margaret would start a new treatment protocol that the Army's improved insurance would cover completely. For the first time in years, the future looked bright with possibility. You know what the best part of today was? Danny asked. What's that? Watching all those people realize that heroes don't always look the way they expect. Sometimes they're 19-year-old radio operators from broken homes. Sometimes they're single mothers fighting cancer while raising future soldiers. Margaret squeezed his hand. Sometimes they're both. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the parking lot of the Fayetteville Cancer Treatment Center, holding a check she still couldn't quite believe was real. The Officers' Wives Club had raised $47,000 in Danny's honor, enough to cover not just her remaining treatments, but to establish a fund for other military families facing similar struggles. Patricia Harrison had personally delivered the check, along with something Margaret treasured even more, a heartfelt apology letter signed by every officer's wife who had participated in the morning's cruelty. Mrs. Chen, Patricia had said, we can't undo what we did, but we can make sure it never happens again, and we can honor your sacrifice the way we should have from the beginning. The treatment center's waiting room was different now. Margaret still sat in the same uncomfortable chairs, still endured the same lengthy procedures, but she no longer faced them alone. The local news coverage of Danny's story had brought dozens of volunteers, many of them military spouses, who understood the unique challenges of service family life. Mrs. Chen? A young woman approached with a warm smile. I'm Ashley Rodriguez, Sergeant Rodriguez's wife. I wanted to thank you again for what Danny did. Margaret had met dozens of family members over the past few weeks, each with their own story of how her son's actions had affected their lives, but the connections went deeper than gratitude. These women understood the weight of loving someone who served, the constant worry, the pride mixed with fear. Ashley, you don't need to thank me. Your husband is a good soldier. Danny was just doing his job. No, Ma'am. Danny went beyond his job. But more than that, he showed all of us what real leadership looks like. Miguel talks about it all the time, how a 19-year-old kid took charge of that situation better than some officers with years of experience. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Danny. OCS is kicking my butt, but I love it. The instructors keep using Kandahar as a case study. Weird hearing them talk about the Chen incident without knowing I'm sitting right there. Love you, Mom. She smiled, imagining her son in the classroom, probably trying not to laugh as tactical instructors, analyzed his split-second decisions under fire. Back at Fort Liberty, the changes were subtle but significant. Colonel Martinez had instituted new protocols for Medal of Honor ceremonies, ensuring that all family members received proper welcome and orientation, regardless of their background or appearance. Patricia Harrison found herself leading sensitivity training sessions for officers' spouses, using her own experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and social prejudice. I thought I understood military sacrifice, she told a room full of wives during one particularly difficult session. I thought because my husband was an officer, because we lived in a nice house on base, because our children went to good schools, that somehow made us more important than other military families. The room was silent as Patricia continued, her voice steady but filled with genuine remorse. I was wrong, dead wrong. Margaret Chen worked 2 jobs while fighting cancer, so her son could serve our country. She sacrificed everything while I worried about my garden club meetings. And when her son performed the most heroic act any of us had ever seen, my first instinct was to mock her and try to have her removed from the ceremony. One of the younger wives raised her hand tentatively. Mrs. Harrison, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? By remembering that rank is what someone wears on their uniform, not what makes them valuable as a human being. By understanding that sacrifice comes in many forms, and the families who struggle the most often give the most to our military community. Patricia looked around the room at faces she'd known for years, women she'd shared countless social events, with many of whom had participated in or quietly witnessed the morning's cruelty without speaking up. We all failed that day. Not just me, but all of us who stayed silent while a hero's mother was humiliated. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again. The story of Danny's heroism and Margaret's treatment at the ceremony had reached far beyond Fort Liberty. Military blogs picked up the story, then major news outlets, then social media. What resonated wasn't just the dramatic rescue operation, but the stark contrast between genuine sacrifice and social pretension. Congressman Richardson's office was flooded with calls supporting improved military family benefits. The Chen Act, as it was being called informally, proposed comprehensive health care coverage for military families dealing with serious medical conditions. The irony is heartbreaking, Richardson told his staff during a planning meeting. We asked these families to sacrifice everything for their country, then force them to choose between medical treatment and keeping the lights on. At the Pentagon, military leadership was taking notice as well. General Patricia Adams, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff, had ordered a comprehensive review of family support services across all installations. The Chen case exposes a cultural problem we've ignored for too long, she told her staff. We talk about taking care of our own, but somehow we've created a 2-tier system where officers' families get respect and enlisted families get charity. That ends now. Military sociologists began studying the incident as an example of how institutional Iraqis could create toxic social dynamics that ultimately undermined unit cohesion and military effectiveness. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a researcher at the Army War College, published a paper titled Heroism and Hierarchy: Lessons from the Chen Incident that became required reading for senior officer development courses. Private First-Class Chen's actions demonstrate that heroism doesn't correlate with rank, she wrote, but the treatment of his mother reveals institutional biases that could prevent us from recognizing and developing leadership potential in our most junior soldiers. At Officer Candidate School, Danny was discovering that fame came with its own challenges. His classmates treated him with a mixture of awe and careful distance, unsure how to relate to someone whose combat actions had become legendary. "Hey, Chen," called out Candidate Williams during a rare break between training exercises. "Is it true you lifted a concrete slab by yourself?" Danny sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead after a grueling tactical exercise. This was the part of medal reception no one had warned him about. The constant questions, the way people looked at him like he was somehow different from any other soldier. "It wasn't that heavy," he said simply. "Adrenaline makes you stronger than you think. Come on, man. We heard you made 5 trips into a collapsing building while taking enemy fire. That's not normal." "Nothing about that day was normal," Danny replied, his voice carrying an edge that made Williams step back. "Normal would have been everyone coming home without anyone getting hurt. Normal would have been accurate intelligence and no ambush. The truth was, Danny struggled with the attention. He'd grown up invisible. The quiet kid from the broken home, the kid whose mother worked too many jobs to attend school events, the kid who enlisted because college wasn't an option. Now, everyone wanted to know his story, to understand what made him special. But Danny didn't feel special. He felt guilty that 6 of his soldiers had been trapped in the first place. He had nightmares about the Taliban fighters he'd killed during the firefight. He woke up some mornings convinced he could have done more, moved faster, made better decisions. His TAC officer, Captain Morrison, no relation to Sergeant Morrison from Afghanistan, had noticed the signs. Danny excelled at every training, exercise, but he pushed himself beyond what was healthy, as if he were trying to prove something to himself. "Chen, I need to see you in my office," Captain Morrison said after Danny had volunteered for extra duty for the 3rd week in a row. Danny reported as ordered, his uniform immaculate, his bearing perfect. But Morrison could see the exhaustion. In his eyes, "Candidate Chen, sit down. This isn't a formal counseling session." Danny remained standing. "I prefer to stand, sir." That wasn't a request. "Sit down." Danny complied reluctantly. "Chen, you're the top performer in your class. Your tactical knowledge is exceptional. Your leadership during exercises is textbook perfect. And your physical fitness scores are off the charts. So why do I get the feeling you're trying to punish yourself?" "I don't understand the question, sir." "The hell you don't. You've volunteered for every extra duty, every additional training exercise, every weekend project since you arrived. When's the last time you called your mother?" The question hit home. Danny had been avoiding Margaret's calls, partly because he was busy, but mostly because he didn't know how to talk to her about the weight of carrying the Medal of Honor. "Sir, I'm just trying to be the best officer candidate I can be." "No, you're trying to be perfect. There's a difference." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Chen, I read your file. I know what happened in Afghanistan. I also know that survivors' guilt is a real thing, and pushing yourself to exhaustion isn't going to change what happened that day." Danny's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Sir, with respect, you weren't there. You're right. I wasn't. But I've been there. For other soldiers dealing with the aftermath of combat. And I'm telling you that whatever you're carrying, whatever you think you should have done differently, it's going to eat you alive if you don't deal with it." That evening, Danny finally called his mother. Margaret answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Danny, I was starting to worry. You haven't called in 2 weeks." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. OCS is just intense." Margaret could hear something in his voice that concerned her. "Danny, are you okay? You sound tired." "I am tired. But that's not—" "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." Danny was quiet for a long moment, struggling with how to voice the thoughts that had been haunting him. "After Dad left, did you ever feel like you could have done more? Like maybe if you'd been different or better, somehow things would have worked out?" Margaret's heart ached for her son. She could hear the guilt in his voice, the self-doubt that success sometimes brought with it. "Oh, Danny, is that what you're thinking about Afghanistan? That you could have done more?" "I don't know. Maybe. 6 guys got trapped because I didn't see the ambush coming. If I'd been paying better attention, if I'd trusted my instincts about that valley—" "Stop right there," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Daniel Chen, you listen to me. You saved 37 lives that day. 37 men came home to their families because of what you did. But 6 of them got hurt. 6 of them are alive. 6 men who would have died if you hadn't gone back. For them, Danny, you can't save everyone from everything. Even heroes can't do that." Danny was quiet, and Margaret could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Mom, how do you deal with people looking at you differently? Everyone here knows about the medal, and they act like I'm a kind of, I don't know, superhero or something, but I'm just me. I'm the same guy who used to be afraid of the dark and couldn't ride a bike until I was 9. Margaret smiled despite her concern. "You know what I told myself when people started treating me differently after the ceremony?" "What?" that their opinions don't change who I am. I'm still the same woman who burned dinner twice a week and bought your school clothes at thrift stores. But now some people respect me more because they know my son is a hero. The only difference is their perception. It's not that simple, Mom, isn't it? Danny, you didn't change when they put that medal around your neck. You're still the boy who used to read military history books under his covers with a flashlight. You're still the young man who sent half his pay home to help with my medical bills. The medal doesn't make you different. It just makes official what I already knew. What's that? That you have the heart of a leader and the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs you something. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the audience at Fort Moore, Georgia, watching her son graduate from officer candidate school. Second Lieutenant Daniel Chen stood among his class, his bearing confident but humble, his uniform bearing the ribbons that marked him as a combat veteran and Medal of Honor recipient. The graduation ceremony was smaller than the Medal of Honor. Presentation, but no less meaningful. These were men and women who had chosen to lead, to take responsibility for other soldiers' lives and welfare. When Danny's name was called, the applause was thunderous. His fellow graduates had learned to see past the medal, to the qualities that made him an exceptional leader, his tactical knowledge, his genuine concern for his soldiers, his ability to make hard decisions under pressure. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photographs and celebrations, Margaret was approached by General Adams, who had made the trip specifically to attend Danny's graduation. Mrs. Chen, I wanted to personally thank you for your son's service and to apologize for the treatment you received at Fort Liberty. Thank you, General. But that's in the past now. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. But I want you to know that your son's story has created positive changes throughout the Army. We're implementing new policies to ensure all military families receive the respect and support they deserve. General Adams gestured toward Danny, who was surrounded by his new brother officers. Your son has a bright future ahead of him. The Army plans to fast-track him for advanced leadership positions. With his combat experience and natural leadership abilities, he could make colonel before he's 30. Margaret watched her son laughing with his classmates, finally looking relaxed and confident in a way she hadn't seen since before his deployment. General, I appreciate that, but I hope the Army remembers that Danny's not special because he's different from other soldiers. He's special because he represents the best of what all soldiers can be. I understand completely. And Mrs. Chen, the Army has approved your son for full educational benefits. When he's ready, he can attend any university in the country with full tuition, room and board covered. Margaret felt tears welling up. He always wanted to study engineering. Then he'll study engineering. It's the least we can do for a family that's given so much to our country. 1 year later, Fort Liberty hosted its annual Medal of Honor Day ceremony. Margaret stood at the podium, addressing an audience of military families, officers, and enlisted. Soldiers gathered on the same parade ground where she'd been humiliated 12 months earlier. When I first came to this base a year ago, she began, her voice steady and clear, I thought I was just here to watch my son receive a medal. I thought it was about him, about what he'd done in Afghanistan. The audience listened intently. Margaret had become something of a celebrity in military circles, not just as the mother of a Medal of Honor recipient, but as an advocate for enlisted families and military family support services. But I learned that day that heroism isn't just about what happens in combat. It's about how we treat each other when no one's watching. It's about recognizing that sacrifice comes in many forms and that respect should be earned through character, not rank. She looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that had become familiar over the past year. Patricia Harrison sat in the front row, now the head of a charitable foundation that provided support for military families facing medical crises. Colonel Martinez had been promoted to Brigadier General, partly based on his leadership in implementing Army-wide family support reforms. The Medal of Honor that my son wears represents more than his actions in Afghanistan. It represents the values that this military community taught him, values that I learned from watching all of you support each other through deployments, through loss, through the daily challenges of military life. Margaret paused, remembering the scared, humiliated woman she'd been a year ago. Today, I want to announce the establishment of the Chen Family Foundation, dedicated to supporting military families facing medical emergencies. But more importantly, I want to challenge all of us to remember that every family in this community has made sacrifices for our country. Every family deserves our respect. The applause was genuine and sustained. In the audience, dozens of families had their own stories of how the events of the previous year had changed their lives. Better medical benefits, improved family support services, and a cultural shift toward recognizing the contributions of all military families, regardless of rank. 5 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Chen stood in his office at the Pentagon, reviewing personnel files for his new assignment as a battalion commander. At 24, he was the youngest battalion commander in the Army, his rapid promotion based on exceptional performance in multiple leadership roles. On his desk sat 2 photographs, one of his Medal of Honor ceremony and another of his mother at her college graduation. Margaret had used the educational benefits extended to military families to complete her nursing degree, graduating summa cum laude at age 57. She now worked as a patient advocate at Walter Reed Medical Center, helping military families navigate the complex healthcare system she'd once struggled with herself. Danny's phone rang. "So you have a call from Mrs. Chen. Put her through." "Danny!" Margaret's voice was bright with excitement. "I just got the most wonderful news. The Chen Family Foundation just reached $1 million in donations. We've helped over 300 military families this year alone. That's incredible, Mom. You should be proud. We should be proud. None of this would have happened without your example in Afghanistan." Danny looked out his office window at the busy Pentagon parking lot, thinking about the journey that had brought them both to this point. "Mom, you know what I figured out after all these years." "What's that?" "That medal isn't really mine. It belongs to everyone who taught me what courage looks like. Sergeant Rodriguez, who showed me how to lead under fire. Captain Morrison, who taught me that strength comes from acknowledging your weaknesses. And you, who showed me that real heroism is getting up every day and taking care of the people who depend on you." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "You know what your father said when he saw you on the news receiving that medal." Danny was surprised. He hadn't heard from his father since he'd left when Danny was 12. "Dad called you?" "He did. He said he was proud of the man you'd become, and that he knew he'd missed out on being part of raising someone special." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you didn't become special in spite of him leaving. You became special because of the choices you made every day to be better than your circumstances. That's not genetics, Danny. That's character." As they talked, Danny thought about the speech he would give tomorrow at the Army War College, where his actions in Afghanistan were now part of the leadership curriculum. He'd titled it "The Ordinary Heroes Among Us," focusing on the countless acts of daily courage that military families performed without recognition. "Mum, I need to ask you something. Do you ever regret how hard our life was when I was growing up?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "Danny, if our life had been easy, if we'd had money and status and all the things other families had, would you have learned to value people for their character instead of their circumstances? Probably not. Would you have understood what real sacrifice looks like? No. Would you have had the empathy to risk your life for soldiers you'd only known for 8 months? Danny smiled, understanding her point. No, I wouldn't have. Then no, I don't regret it. Every struggle, every hardship, every moment when I didn't know how we were going to make it through another week, all of that shaped you into the man who could save 37 lives and then come home to help save thousands more through the changes you've inspired. After they hung up, Danny returned to his personnel files. Tomorrow, he would take command of a battalion of 800 soldiers, many of them young enlisted troops from backgrounds similar to his own. His job would be to train them, lead them, and prepare them for whatever challenges their service might bring. But more than that, his job would be to recognize the potential for heroism in every soldier under his command, regardless of their rank, their background, or their family's social status. He picked up the first file. Private First Class Rodriguez, recently graduated from basic training, mother working 2 jobs to support 3 children. The name made him smile, remembering Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been trapped under that concrete in Afghanistan. Danny made a note in the file. Recommend for advanced leadership training. Monitor for promotion potential. It was a small decision, barely worth noting in the vast bureaucracy of the military. But Danny understood that heroism often began with someone seeing potential where others saw only problems, recognizing character where others saw only circumstances. Outside his window, the sun was setting over the Potomac River, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in North Carolina, his mother was preparing for another day of helping military families navigate their own struggles. Somewhere in military bases around the world, young soldiers were making the same choice Danny had made in that Afghan valley, to risk everything for the people who counted on them. The Medal of Honor still hung in a frame on his office wall, but Danny had learned that the real honor wasn't in the medal itself. It was in the daily decision to live up to the values it represented: courage, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that no one gets left behind. As night fell over Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Chen began planning the training that would prepare his soldiers for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that heroism wasn't born in moments of crisis. It was built day by day, choice by choice, in the ordinary decisions to take care of each other and never give up on the people who mattered most.